Was it the most spectacular fall from grace of a modern royal, or simply the logical consequence of years of overstepping boundaries? This question marked the beginning of the day when what had been circulating as a rumor for months was confirmed. Prince Harry had to leave the United States, not voluntarily, but under immense legal pressure. The news hit the public like a ton of bricks. A prince, once a symbol of new beginnings and self-determination, suddenly became a case study in a failed exile. His departure from Los Angeles didn't mark a pathetic farewell, but the abrupt end of an American dream built on special status and global attention. The process developed a dynamic that went far beyond a private decision. In Washington, a sober review had long been underway. In London, preparations were being made for a return that no one wanted to call a homecoming anymore. As the relevant authorities initiated the final steps, evidence mounted that Prince Harry's continued stay in the U.S. was no longer legally tenable. The reasons were obvious: lost supporters, expiring contracts, a lack of institutional backing. What had once been sold as a privileged new beginning now revealed itself as a legal dead end. The timing was particularly explosive. Within a few weeks, a house of cards collapsed, one that had been held up for years by media contracts and symbolic significance. The loss of key partnerships undermined the very foundation of his stay. Without a viable sponsor, the formal anchor point was gone. Thus, a status once considered exclusive transformed into a risk that authorities could no longer ignore. The step Prince Harry ultimately had to take was not an act of self-determination, but the consequence of a formal procedure. At the same time, public pressure mounted. Every move, every delay was commented on, every file scrutinized. On social media, schadenfreude and sympathy mingled. Meanwhile, international media outlets were already describing his return as the dismantling of a myth. The narrative of the rebellious prince who had escaped the court had been shattered. In its place emerged the image of a man caught between two systems. In the U.S. without a legal basis, in Britain without institutional support. The departure itself became symbolic. No private jet, no discreet arrangement, but a regular commercial flight. Observers spoke of a staged return to normality that seemed harsher than any demonstrative measure. The contrast between his former special status and current reality was unmistakable. What remained was the question of responsibility. Was this outcome inevitable, or could it have been prevented had different decisions been made? In London, the palace reacted with cool precision. Words were carefully chosen, formulations kept matter of fact. It was not about familial reconciliation, but about managing a problem that had taken on international dimensions. The tone signaled distance and finality. A return was acknowledged, but not welcomed. Special privileges or preferential treatment were not up for discussion. The institution wanted to create clarity and prevent further escalation. Thus began a new chapter, the full implications of which were not yet foreseeable. The return meant not only a geographical change, but a reassessment of his own role. Prince Harry faced the reality that the narrative of independence and self-realization had foundered on legal, financial, and political boundaries. The beginning of this downfall felt like a cry for help, not only for him, but for a public that had believed for years in the inviolability of royal prerogatives. Whether this moment will go down in history as a turning point or a final break remains to be seen. What is clear is that the departure from America was more than just a journey. It was the visible beginning of a phase in which questions of responsibility, loyalty, and consequences are being re-examined. Was this downfall inevitable, or could a different course have prevented the end? Music. The core of the drama lay not in a single decision, but in a chain of developments that reinforced each other until no way out remained. At the heart of it, music. Was Prince Harry's legal status in the United States, which for years had been taken for granted. But this very status proved to be a fragile construct. What began as a privileged foundation for a new life gradually crumbled under the weight of public statements, political sensitivity, and economic realities. The moment authorities took a closer look was the moment the system began to tip. Crucially, the conditions under which Prince Harry could even remain in the U.S. were reassessed. His residency permit was tied to conditions that were not merely formal but required continuous fulfillment. These included active professional activity, institutional support, and legal immunity, which is scrutinized particularly rigorously for prominent figures. As key partners withdrew and projects stalled, this foundation began to erode. Without visible successes and without a clear perspective, his status lost its justification. Added to this was a dimension that had long been underestimated: the impact of his own public pronouncements. Statements once celebrated as signs of openness and authenticity suddenly took on a new meaning. In a legal context, they transformed from personal anecdotes into legally binding evidence. Authorities were forced to assess this content not emotionally, but formally. The leeway that celebrity often affords shrank. What remained was a stark set of documents that left little room for exceptions. At the same time, the economic situation worsened. Revenue streams considered reliable proved volatile. Media contracts that had legitimized the new state lost value or were terminated. Without a stable financial foundation, it became increasingly difficult to meet the formal requirements. A system built on continuous performance and reputation is sensitive to stagnation. It was precisely this stagnation that proved Prince Harry's undoing. The authorities acted gradually but decisively. First, there were internal reviews, then formal warnings, and finally binding decisions. Each of these steps further reduced the available options. Attempts to find alternatives or establish transitional solutions failed due to a lack of substance. Without a viable future, only one option remained: terminating his residency. This process was not conducted in a public-facing manner, but rather administratively. This very fact made it irreversible. In the public perception, the events coalesced into a narrative of failure. The loss of residency rights became a symbol of a larger collapse. Commentators spoke of a self-disenchantment, in which the special status of a royal was, for the first time, completely subjected to the logic of state procedures. The question of privileges arose anew. How far do they extend when legal frameworks apply? In Prince Harry's case, the answer was clearly not far enough. This development acted like a domino effect. With the loss of his legal status, other areas of his life also lost their stability. Planning security ceased to exist, and perspectives became blurred. Residency in the USA, once an expression of freedom and a new beginning, became a burden that grew heavier every day. Ultimately, the realization dawned that public sympathy is no substitute for a legal foundation and media attention offers no institutional protection. Part Z of this downfall demonstrates how quickly a supposedly secure foundation can crumble when key pillars disappear. Prince Harry's fall is thus more than a personal story. It is a lesson in how closely public perception, legal reality, and economic stability are intertwined. Was this failure the result of individual decisions or an inevitable outcome of a system that allows no room for lasting exceptions? The collapse of his legal status was accompanied by a second, equally consequential process: the financial collapse of the Californian lifestyle. The Monteito estate, once presented as a safe haven, became the most visible symbol of this failure. What had been sold as an exclusive new beginning turned out to be a risky investment, whose foundation rested on a steady income and a stable reputation. When these pillars crumbled, a quiet but inexorable decline began, eventually culminating in formal measures. Initially, there were signs that went largely unnoticed outside the immediate circle: delayed payments, renegotiated terms, internal restructuring. But behind the scenes, the situation was escalating. The estate's running costs were no longer commensurate with the dwindling income. Media contracts, once considered long-term security, lost their appeal. Projects were postponed, expectations unmet. The financial balance was disrupted. The situation escalated when formal steps were taken. With the filing, the problem moved from the private sphere into the institutional arena. The Californian dream, presented for years as proof of independence, was suddenly a matter of record. Ownership, once an expression of success, became a liability. The public perceived this as a censorship. The place that had promised protection became evidence of vulnerability. This development had both psychological and strategic consequences. Without a secure home, not only was a logistical anchor missing, but also a symbol of control. The narrative of self-determination that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had built up over years lost its credibility. The impression arose that the entire project was based on an overestimation of its own viability. Critics spoke of hubris, supporters of tragic miscalculations. Regardless of the assessment, the fact remained. The numbers spoke for themselves. At the same time, external obligations intensified. Outstanding debts and unpaid bills weighed heavily on the overall picture. Every additional day without a resolution increased the pressure. This phase revealed how closely intertwined legal, financial, and reputational factors were. The loss of residency rights exacerbated the economic crisis. The economic crisis, in turn, weakened any negotiating position. A vicious cycle ensued, from which there was no easy escape. The media response followed this downfall with relentless precision. Images of the estate, reports of outstanding payments, and speculation about the future dominated the headlines. The focus shifted from personal motives to structural issues. How could a project with so much startup capital and attention of this kind falter? The answer lay less in individual mistakes than in dependence on a system that demands constant success. For Prince Harry, this period marked the definitive loss of control over his own narrative. His room for maneuver shrank to a minimum. Instead of shaping the future, there was only reaction. Instead of planning, there was improvised damage control. The house in Monteito thus became a monument to a failed experiment in which prestige and reality drifted apart. The idea of establishing himself permanently outside institutional structures proved to be an illusion. At the end of this chapter came a bitter realization. Financial freedom without a stable foundation is deceptive. The loss of the house meant more than saying goodbye to a place. It marked the collapse of an idea. Could this have been avoided if countermeasures had been taken earlier? Or was the Californian project doomed from the start? With the financial and legal collapse, another development, long hidden in the background, came to a head: the gradual decoupling of Meghan Markle. While outwardly unity was still projected, internally priorities and responsibilities shifted. Observers noted that decisions were increasingly being made separately. What had once been presented as an indissoluble alliance now showed clear cracks. In a period of maximum pressure, the differing strategies for dealing with the crisis became apparent. Meghan Markle reacted early with structural adjustments. Business activities were reorganized, and responsibilities were clearly separated. The focus shifted to independence, risk minimization, and the protection of existing resources. These measures appeared rational and controlled to the outside world, but internally resembled a silent retreat. While Prince Harry attempted to stabilize legal and financial fronts simultaneously, Meghan Markle focused on distancing herself from escalating risks. The turning point lay less in a single event than in the cumulative effect of these steps. Joint projects lost their significance, and strategic decisions were no longer communicated jointly. In the public eye, the impression of an asymmetrical burden arose. While Prince Harry increasingly appeared as the source of problems, Meghan Markle positioned herself as an independent actor with a clear agenda for the future. This shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The media interpreted this process as a departure. Commentators spoke of a calculated move, motivated less by emotion than by strategy. The narrative unity of the Sussexes, long a central element of their public image, disintegrated. What remained was an image of isolation, with Prince Harry bearing the consequences alone. The contrast between public silence and structural reorganization reinforced the impression of a rupture. During this phase, it became clear how much the joint project had relied on external stability. As soon as this stability disappeared, differing risk assessments came to light. For Meghan Markle, securing her own position was paramount. For Prince Harry, managing immediate consequences. This divergence left little room for a common course. Decisions that would previously have been coordinated were now made in parallel and led in different directions. The impact on Prince Harry was profound. Without the support of his closest partner, his isolation intensified. His departure from the US was effectively a solitary one. This reinforced the image of a personal downfall, no longer cushioned by familial or partnered solidarity. The public narrative definitively shifted from a shared struggle against external forces to an individual crisis. This raised a new question for the public. Was this decoupling a necessary protective mechanism, or the final proof of the failure of an alliance that seemed destined to last? In any case, this phase marked a turning point. The separation of strategies also meant the separation of responsibilities. Prince Harry now stood exposed without an inner shield, vulnerable to legal, financial, and institutional consequences. Part 4 shows how crises redefine relationships. Meghan Markle's quiet distancing became the catalyst for a solo effort that further exacerbated Prince Harry's situation. Was this step inevitable to limit the damage? Or was it the moment when a shared history definitively became two separate paths? The return to Great Britain did not mark a new beginning, but rather the entry into a tightly controlled reality. What had previously been associated with diplomatic privileges, discreet protection, and institutional considerations, as well as procedures deliberately kept low-key, was now gone. Prince Harry did not set foot on British soil as a representative of the Crown, but as a civilian whose status had been reassessed. This moment became the visible expression of a strategic shift that had long been decided upon within the system. At its core was a security and administrative logic that left no room for special treatment. The arrival took place without any formal protocol, without symbolic gestures. The procedures followed clear rules. The message was unambiguous. The institution defined the framework, not the individual. For the public, this revealed a break that ran deeper than any formal explanation. The protection that had once been taken for granted was no longer available. Internally, this new order was understood as a necessary measure to minimize risks and draw clear boundaries. The name given to this approach was emblematic of isolation and control. The aim was to avoid uncertainty and limit the influence of an actor perceived as unpredictable. In this context, Prince Harry was treated not as a family member, but as a potential disruptive element. The transition from emotional bond to institutional distance was complete. The effect of this approach was immediately apparent. Without an official residence, without state protection, and without access to familiar structures, Prince Harry had to improvise. Every move was visible, every decision potentially vulnerable. The media accompanied this situation with a mixture of analysis and sensationalism. His former special status was not only revoked, but publicly negated. This also changed the narrative. The rebellious royal became a figure of administrative control. Simultaneously, the internal dynamics of the monarchy intensified. Decisions were no longer implemented hesitantly, but with remarkable consistency. The priority was stability and protection. Personal considerations receded into the background. To observers, this attitude appeared cold, but for the institution it was logical. Experience in recent years had shown that ambiguity and emotional compromises could create new points of attack. In the public eye, the return became a symbolic event. The idea that a member of the royal family could be treated like anyone else was unsettling for many. At the same time, it was seen as a signal of strength. The monarchy presented itself as a system that also sets boundaries internally. This demonstration of control was aimed not only inwards but also outwards. It was intended to show that loyalty and discretion remained central values. For Prince Harry, this period meant an existential shift. The absence of institutional support forced him to redefine himself. His room for maneuver was limited. His options manageable. The return, once interpreted as a potential reconciliation, turned out to be an administrative measure with clear conditions. The feeling of being part of a larger whole gave way to the reality of individual responsibility. Part 5 illustrates how consistently systems react when they feel threatened. The return to Great Britain was not staged as a homecoming, but as a controlled process. Was this harshness necessary to protect the institution, or was it definitive proof that personal ties must take a back seat to state logic? At the end of this dramatic cycle, the question was no longer one of legal details or financial losses, but of familial belonging. The monarchy now openly presented itself as what it had always been at its core, an institution that draws clear boundaries both internally and externally. For Prince Harry, this was the most painful realization of his downfall. The return had not built a bridge to reconciliation, but had definitively exposed the distance. The silence from his closest family circle resonated louder than any public statement. Where informal channels, private conversations, and symbolic gestures had once existed, there was now formal reticence. The institution spoke. The family remained silent. This separation was deliberate. It was intended to make clear that loyalty is non-negotiable and that attacks on the system have long-term consequences. Prince Harry's position was thus clearly defined, outside the inner circle, without privileged access. In the public eye, the focus shifted once again. The discussion revolved less around scandals and more around responsibility. Commentators analyzed the family's role and the severity of the reaction. Was this distancing necessary to avert further damage, or was it an expression of a coldness that forgives no mistakes? The monarchy itself left these questions unanswered. Its strategy relied on silence and stability rather than justification. For Prince Harry, this period became an existential test. Without familial support, without institutional ties, and without a clear perspective, all that remained was to confront his own decisions. The loss of trust proved more lasting than any material damage. The role that had once given him a clear identity no longer existed. What remained was the challenge of repositioning himself outside a system that had shaped him and now rejected him. At the same time, the institution's adaptability became apparent. The monarchy used the crisis to consolidate its structures and redefine its boundaries. The clear line was interpreted internally as a strength. It signaled decisiveness and consistency. Outwardly, she conveyed the impression that even familial ties were subordinated to the protection of the system. This message was unmistakable and, for many observers, as fascinating as it was disturbing. At the end of this development was an image deeply etched into the collective memory. A man once part of one of the world's most powerful family networks, now reduced to individual responsibility. Prince Harry's story transformed from a narrative of liberation to one of isolation. The question of whether this path could have been avoided remained open. What was certain was that his return did not mark a new beginning, but rather the end of a chapter characterized by conflict and alienation. This conclusion casts a long shadow. It compels us to reflect on the limits of loyalty, freedom, and responsibility. Was Prince Harry a victim of a relentless system, or the architect of his own downfall? And what does this case reveal about the price paid when personal narratives collide with institutional realities? The events surrounding Prince Harry paint a picture of an extraordinary downfall that extends far beyond personal drama. A privileged new beginning in the United States developed into a chain of legal, financial, and institutional consequences, ultimately culminating in a forced return to Great Britain. The loss of his residency rights, the economic collapse of his Californian lifestyle, and Meghan Markle's gradual isolation formed the central stages of this decline. It became particularly clear how fragile special status can be when it is not permanently secured by merit, stability, and institutional support. Public self-destruction, economic miscalculation, and the break with traditional structures reinforced each other. The monarchy reacted not emotionally, but strategically. With clear boundaries and administrative consistency, it drew a line that allowed for no further exceptions. In the end, there is a man without institutional protection, without familial support, and without a clear future. The story raises fundamental questions about responsibility, loyalty, and the price of self-promotion. It invites reflection on whether this crash was inevitable or the result of a series of avoidable decisions.